Hello and welcome to In the Garden with Flower Hill Farm, a podcast brought to you by Botanical Interests. I'm your host, Nicole Pitt, and I'm so glad you're with us. Today we are going to be talking about permaculture. Permaculture is all about teaming up with nature and creating self-sustaining outdoor spaces, working in harmony, like a forest right in your backyard. The goal is to integrate land, resources, and people with minimal waste. The focus is building self-sufficient ecosystems through thoughtful design. Coming up, we will be joined by author Brandy Hall. She's been helping people build these ecosystems in their own backyards since 2008. And she's just written a book about how you can do the same at home. I'm excited to chat with Brandy coming up in just a bit. Permaculture combines a variety of plants such as perennials, natives, climbers, ground covers, trees, and cover crops. Now, cover crops help feed the soil. And that brings us to our seed of the day. Crimson clover cover crop seeds. That's a mouthful. Now, cover crops have been used in farming and gardening since ancient times, and they are used to enrich the soil, prevent erosion, and improve water filtration. Now, crimson clover is a popular cover crop. Not only does it fix nitrogen in the soil, it also has a beautiful red plume that invites beneficial insects to the party. For maximum nitrogen, you can till, mow, or cut back at the end of the bloom before the seeds form. And bonus, you can also harvest the clover heads to make a tea. It's working for you in more ways than one. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we are diving deep into permaculture with Brandy Hall. Hello, and welcome back to In the Garden with Flower Hill Farm. Today's guest is the founder of Shades of Green Permaculture, a leader in regenerative design, transforming landscapes into thriving ecosystems. Please welcome Brandy Hall. Brandy, I'm so glad you're with us today. How are you?
I'm doing great, Nicole. Thank you so much for having me.
So you're all about permaculture. Tell those who might not be familiar with it, how do you define permaculture beyond the textbook definition?
That's a great question. So if you look on the internet, there are a million ways people talk about permaculture or define permaculture. But the way I really like to think about it is it's an ethical design science that integrates human activity into our natural landscapes so that we become active participants in the regeneration of our land versus sort of passive observers.
How did you get into this?
Very circuitously, I would say. So I grew up, my mom and my dad divorced when I was really young, and my dad lives in Western North Carolina, and my mom and my stepdad are in South Florida. Kind of very divergent paths in a way. So I grew up kind of going between the two places. And my mom and my stepdad were in the nursery business, the ornamental plant and seed industry in South Florida. On commercial farms, lots of spraying, lots of herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, all of the things. And when they were in the business, they were spraying what were really minimally regulated chemicals, but they were using these hot suits or these protective suits that in theory kept the chemicals from coming into contact with them. But in actuality, when they would get wet from the sweat of being in the hot houses of South Florida and the 100-degree weather, it would function more like a semi-permeable membrane. So it was actually trapping the chemicals against their skin. And they went from like 0 to 1,000 in terms of chemical sensitivity over a period of just a couple of years. My stepdad was in a wheelchair with gout-like symptoms. He was having nosebleeds that would last for several hours at a time. Getting his joints drained because they were swelling regularly. And so my mom took over the business and was, at that point, was having allergic reactions when she would smell the neighbors spraying or, basically would smell that there had been chemicals sprayed. But she was able to manage those reactions most of the time with Benadryl. But they started escalating. And then kind of the last straw was she went to go make a delivery and she pulled into a greenhouse. She got out of the car and it was apparent immediately that they had just sprayed. So she got back in the car, she took Benadryl, she got my stepdad from the farm, which was right around the corner. They picked me up on the way to school or on the way to the hospital. They picked me up from school. And in that time, she just started going into anaphylactic shock, and she shook the panel of the door off of the car. And her hands were drawing up like she was having a stroke, and she was choking on her tongue, and, just a really extreme allergic reaction. So very quickly after that, they were like, we can't do this. We moved to the woods in North Florida, and they went through what started like a 7-year detox. But then you take that sort of early impression, and
Yeah,
then
that's a big
juxtaposed,
impression.
it's a big
Yeah.
impression, and then juxtaposed with, growing up in Western North Carolina and drinking from springs and spending time in the temperate rainforest and swimming in clear waters and eating from my dad's organic garden, and just like night and day in a lot of ways, that started this early inquiry, I think, into like there just a felt sense like there's got to be a different way. Like this earth is so beautiful and it's just so majestic. And yet as humans, we sort of take that for granted and devise all of these systems that are kind of absurd in a
Mhm.
way, you
How
know.
old were you when it happened?
It started when I was really young, when we lived on the farm. We moved off of the farm when I was about 7, and then that happened when I was in middle school.
Oh, yeah,
So,
middle school. Yeah, that sticks
yeah.
with you. Yeah.
hmm and so then, as a young adult, I got a general contractor's license, and I worked with a natural building company and became a stonemason apprentice, and traveled and first became exposed to permaculture, and then worked on a farm for a few years, and then started the company in 2008.
Yeah. Tell me
So
about your company. I'm very curious about what you guys actually do. It sounds really amazing.
thanks. Yeah. So we've grown to almost 40 full-time employees. So it's grown quite a bit since those days when it was in my living room. um, so we are regenerative design build firm. We also do maintenance. So we do caretaking services, which are like horticulture services with clients. And we also do ecological lawn care. So helping people transition conventional lawns into um, mowable meadows of sorts, and, weaning them off of fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers and chemicals and too much irrigation and all of those things. And then we also do education. So we have a digital course. We've had thousands of students from around the country that have gone through that class called the Regenerative Backyard Blueprint, just helping homeowners that are outside of our service area. We're based in Atlanta, Georgia, and we serve, mostly the metro area with some clients in, more rural Southeast. Um, but yeah, helping homeowners do what we do in their own yards through our online programming.
So, walk me through kind of a consultation. Say I live in your area and I want you to come and help me in my, landscape. What do you do when you go to someone's house? Do you kind of, how long does that process take?
Yeah. So we do it a couple of different ways. We have, for like more complex projects that involve full site water systems, or, extensive hardscaping, or that are just larger, maybe have a a new construction or renovation component. We'll go through a full design process where we start with just an online consultation with our clients to understand the scope of what it is that they're looking for so that we can put forth a proposal. And then our team goes out onto the site and we do an extensive site analysis. So we take survey data, GIS data, and we do a really comprehensive mapping of the existing conditions. And that's really the foundation for all responsive regenerative design, because it's in relationship to the existing conditions
Mhm.
and working with the natural, the light patterns, the soil, the vegetation, the way water's flowing, so that we can use all of those conditions as an asset to grow different types of ecosystems that are, relationally appropriate, and in
Mhm.
context, rather than trying to force, a Southern California style garden in an Eastern deciduous hardwood forest, for example.
Mhm.
So, you know, yeah. So it generally is a few hours that we're on site for that first site analysis, and then we go through a design process where we put down all of the ideas and reflect the goals of the client onto the map. And then we get feedback around that. And then we start to detail it out into, a regenerative water system and plant communities and soil building strategies and hardscaping plans. And then we work with clients. Sometimes, just they want to get it all done immediately. And many of our clients want to phase things in and become stewards and understand what it is that they're working with. So those can be long-term relationships.
Yeah. Are a lot of your clients hands-on? They like to be involved in the process?
Yeah. And when we get to, the end of the design and installation, then we move into our maintenance services. And we like to think of like the way we can graduate clients. So our work is done when they feel empowered to like go out and actually do, if they want, not all of our clients want to, but many of them are very interested. I think people are drawn to this type of landscaping because they want to grow food, or they're, passionate about pollinator health and biodiversity, and they're curious and, growing herbs and medicinal plants and songbird habitat. Like I think there's a natural curiosity to a lot of our clients where they do it because they want to be engaged with the land.
Are there any common misconceptions about what permaculture is?
I like to use the example when I first moved to Atlanta. I think there were some people teaching about permaculture, and the perspective that a lot of people that had been exposed to it around here was like everything needed to be built out of pallets, and it involved eating a lot of roadkill. So, yeah, exactly. Which, I mean, that, there's room for all of it. But I think a lot of the work that we've done over we're coming up on 18 years in business, is really trying to understand the context of permaculture within an urban and suburban world where people live, they work off site. They're not interested in growing all of their food. They're not going to live off grid, So yeah, a lot of the work has really just been trying to define, like, what does it look like realistically? What does a regenerative landscape look like in this urban and suburban context where, you're not moving to Middle Tennessee to live on 100 acres all by yourself,
right?
And, grow everything, which there's a time and a place for that. But the UN, or I think it's the UN, published a study that by 2050, 68% of people will live in urban centers globally. So if we think about that, does regeneration then exclude, 32% of the population, or 68% of the population? Is regenerative agriculture or regenerative landscaping only for those 32%? Or how does it become relevant to everyone? Because we all interact with land, and that's really, it's been a big push in our work.
What are some of the plants that you like to use when you're building a permaculture?
All kinds. It really depends on the goals of the client. So we really think about how plants work together to build an ecosystem, rather than just individual pretty things that we put around our landscapes. So, some clients they have a fully shaded woodland site and they're really interested in songbirds, right? Or pollinators. And so that might be a really like woodland species native plant type of garden. We have some clients that are really passionate about growing food. So we might incorporate a lot more edible perennials and fruit trees and berries and, lots of space for vegetable gardening. So it really just depends. But one of the things that we look to in any planting design, so in the book I have that comes out today, The Complete Guide to Home Permaculture, I talk in the plant section about the 13 functions that plants can have within our landscape. And if every plant that we're putting into our plant palette is fulfilling, at least 3 of those functions, then we're building a lot of resilience just inherently through the plants that we're choosing. So examples of that might be, dynamic accumulation, some of the ones that are more common in permaculture, like dynamic accumulation, where they have deeper tap roots and they're pulling nutrients up, and dropping those in the upper horizons through their leaves and making those nutrients available to more shallow rooted plants. Or nitrogen fixers. So we're all familiar with those, like clover and peas and things. But then some of the, other kind of functions you might see, aside from beauty, you've got medicine, you've got culinary herbs, you've got privacy. That's a big one that comes up, in an urban and suburban kind of world because we're kind of stacked in on top of each other and people like to have this feeling of sanctuary in their yards. So privacy is one that we think about a lot. Obviously pollinator nectaries. There's so many functions, 13 that I've identified that we can do.
What do you do when you come across a client that maybe has a really bad invasive species problem? How do you handle those?
hmm It's really common. So in Atlanta, we battle, there's a lot of English ivy that takes over our forests. There's a lot of kudzu in sort of these open areas. Those are two of the really big ones. And how we go about it, I think the first kind of reframe is, nature abhors a vacuum. You hear that adage all the time, right? So we don't want to just take it out and then just leave it blank for something else to fill in. And we don't want to spray it with herbicides that are going to make the soils less hospitable to more tender native species, essentially creating conditions where only aggressive species are going to thrive. So usually what we do is, depending on the scale, sometimes we recommend that they pulse graze goats or sheep first and try to get the vegetation under control that way. A lot of times we remove it by hand, and then make sure that we have a planting plan in place to, replace what we take out.
They can be absolutely just horrible to get rid of. And for us, I don't really have an English ivy problem up here in New York, but we do have some stuff that just doesn't want to go away.
Right.
So it's hard, but it really is a hard thing to get rid of. What do we have? What's the name of
Knotweed.
it? Yeah, we do have a little bit of that, but there is something that we have that I cannot remember the name of, but it's bishop's weed. That's what it is. Yes, it's a bishop's weed. We have that, and I don't have it at my house. Cross my fingers, knock on wood, but my neighbors have it. And I can't tell you how many times they've offered a plant to me. And I have said, I'm so sorry, I cannot take that plant.
I don't want to.
There's a chance that in the soil, there's going to be a bishop's weed root, and I cannot have that taking over my entire landscape. But that's why it's important that you see all of these restrictions that are on shipping plants and stuff, because you never want to introduce a new native species to a property that wasn't there before. So
yeah, and there are things that you can do to kind of keep the weed bank at bay. So for instance, we have a lot of very aggressive turf grasses here, like Bermuda grass, where if we're trying to transition from a lawn to a meadow or a lawn to a planting bed, for those we'll scrape the top layer, and then there's still those little roots that are in the clay or in the soil. And so then on top of that, we'll usually sheet mulch and at least set it back enough that the other things have the opportunity to get established. And then it's a matter of hand weeding and keeping things mulched.
What do you use for when you say sheet mulch? What is that?
So sheet mulching is a technique of using cardboard as a weed barrier, basically. So you're adding organic material to the landscape. You're also, shading out the soil. So you don't have the seed bank doesn't have the opportunity to flush because you're just completely covering it with cardboard. And then you can put down, if you're planting into it, we'll usually put down cardboard and then some compost and then put the plants in, and then hardwood mulch on top of that. If you're trying to just smother out a grassy area or an area of a lot of aggressive species, you might just put down cardboard and then mulch on top of that really heavily while you're getting it to transition.
Yeah. So how is permaculture different from traditional gardening for people who are still wondering?
That's a great question. I think it is different in a lot of ways. So it's really driven by responding to the site and building regeneration. So the way I like to think of permaculture, when I first started out, I would teach permaculture design certifications, and there are like 20 principles or 7 principles or 15 principles, depending on, which kind of philosophy you adhere to. And and all of these different techniques. And it can be very confusing, I think, for people that first start out trying to understand what it is. And when, when I started online teaching and stopped doing the in-person design certification course, I was like, I really just want to make this as digestible to like the average person who doesn't come at it necessarily from the perspective, I want to grow all my own food, which I think the roots of permaculture, that's a lot of how it's typically taught. But how do we whittle this down? How do I synthesize this into something that's just like a very straightforward framework? And so from that kind of inquiry, I distilled it to the 3 pillars of a regenerative landscape. That's what the book is all about. So it's basically the first pillar of a regenerative landscape is work with water as a resource to restore the water cycle. So rather than treating it as a nuisance that we send away, we let it slow down and sink into our site. And there are a million different techniques that you can do to create that. The second pillar is to integrate waste as a resource to build soil fertility. So this is how we think about closing the loops and keeping our nutrients on site, whether it's something like keeping our leaves, using our leaves for covering compost, composting all of our kitchen scraps and our yard scraps. Like there are a bunch of different ways that we can keep nutrients on site. And then the third is build plant communities rather than just individual plants, right? Plant communities. So that we restore biodiversity. And so if there are a lot of ways we can do each one of those pillars, and it's very it's very specific to the site. Are you on a steep slope? That's going to affect how you manage water versus if you're in a bowl, But what does your soil composition look like? In Georgia, we have a lot of clay. We don't have a ton of organic material, which is also after development that, a standard building practice is to scrape off the topsoil and sell it, and you're left with this compacted clay subsoil, and so a lot of the soil work that we do is really about just rebuilding the ability of the land to hold water, building up the organic material. So you're creating this sort of like sponge layer. And then, of course, designing plant communities that boost biodiversity and fulfill human needs and, all of these.
Do you have an example of like a plant community?
Yeah, depending on what kind of, space you're in. But an example of a sunny plant community would be something like, or sunny, dry plant community. Here we use a lot of muhly grass. So Muhlenbergia capillaris, and it's a native grass, a bunching grass. It gets tall. It's got beautiful flowers in the fall. This little like hazy purple cloud. It does a great work of decompacting the soil. And then we might layer in something like black-eyed Susans, which are native pollinator attracting, supporting plant, or echinacea, which is medicinal, or butterfly milkweed, little blue stem grass, which is another native bunching grass. And those provide sort of the structure to some of the perennials that might otherwise kind of like flop, and some seasonal interest. So that's a really common like full sun, dry site kind of planting plan we might use. And maybe we pepper in some trees. Like one of my favorite we call it the strip of death, where the area between the sidewalk and the street where all the dogs want to come and trample and poop and pee and all the things. We plant often there. We'll do like service berries, which need very little inputs, like no irrigation. They can just take the heat, the dry, and then use something like Russian sage, which is an amazing pollinator support plant, and muhly grass and echinacea and milkweed. And that makes just a gorgeous flowering plant community that doesn't really need any, inputs.
No, even in a dry summer, you always see the black-eyed Susans just in beautiful bloom along the roadside. So do you have like a rain collection system advice for people who maybe have the ability to collect their own rainwater to use?
Yeah. So there are a lot of ways that you can think about collecting rainwater. There's above ground tanks that you might use for irrigating your vegetable garden or, washing your car. people use it for all different kinds of ways. You could use it for, potable indoor use with the proper filtration. So there's the actual like tank collection systems, but then you can also think of your soil as the storage for rainwater. So my advice typically is let's look as high on the watershed as possible, which oftentimes is the roof in
Mm-hmm.
a residential landscape. Like where's the water coming from and where can we send it within the landscape that it's going to be the biggest asset,
Mm-hmm.
right? So a lot of times our building practices are we're just going to take these downspouts and we're going to run them to the driveway, and the driveway goes to the street, and the street goes to the stormwater, system, and then that goes to our creeks and rivers. And so what we see when we're not slowing the water down and sinking it in is we see these massive flash floods that happen in heavy rains. So all of the water's running off really quickly. Our stormwater infrastructure is not sized for the amount of impervious surface that we have out in the world now with the development. So we see flash floods. And then the flip side of that is in times of drought, our soil hasn't held any of that water. And so we need to do a lot more irrigation.
Yeah.
And so what I typically, what we do a lot with our clients is how do we take these downspouts from our roof and route them to a series of maybe a tank, and then maybe the tank overflows to a series of rain gardens or contoured swales or creek beds, depending on the topography, and ultimately terminating in some earthwork that allows the water to sink in the area where the roots of the plants are. So it might be actual rain garden plantings, or those go in irrigate fruit trees. There's so many ways. It's fun to talk and to think about water because there's so many ways to kind of like plug and play different techniques to dance it around the land so that it's hydrating the soil. And then on top of that, just building constantly your organic material, whether it's through compost or mulch or sheet mulching or chopping your cover crops down and laying it down and letting that green material break down. Anything that we can do to build up the organic material is going to support our land's ability to hold water over time.
Mm.
And then that reduces the need for irrigation.
Absolutely.
So it's a win-win.
Well, I have an unheated hoop house at my farm where I grow some cut flowers, and because it's not irrigated all year round, I'm finding that it doesn't hold water well at all, and it's something that I'm trying to solve myself. And so I don't love that the soil just doesn't hold water; it puddles instead of just going into the soil. So that's something I'm dealing with. I know adding compost and stuff to that soil does help a lot, but it's a long-term problem that I'm thinking about taking the poly off of it seasonally, just so that the natural rainwater can collect there instead. But
that makes sense.
yeah. So I am so excited that you are now taking the knowledge that you have in Georgia and you've putting it down inside a book that anyone can learn from. So talk about what people are going to take away from the book if they're looking forward to creating a permaculture of their own.
Great. Yeah. So, I mean, as you're saying, it's like these are techniques. There are certain techniques that work better in Georgia than they would in upstate New York, but the pattern level thinking around slowing water down, using water as a resource, building our soil and integrating waste, and building plant communities that serve many functions and support biodiversity. Those are things that can be done in any climate, on any budget, with any experience level. It's really just a matter of plug and play with different techniques that are appropriate to the climate. So in the book, I break down really in depth the 3 pillars and how those might look in different situations. And just give really actionable things that people could do with each one of the pillars in their own yards, whether it's what type of compost system makes the most sense for my living situation. Are you in an apartment? Are you on a farm? It's going to look very different depending, but there are options regardless. What types of plants, how to build appropriate plant palettes. I give examples of plants that grow well in our region, but also teach the framework of how do you build a plant palette out in the world where you are.
So if someone wanted to start developing a permaculture in their backyard, what would the first thing that you would tell them to do? What's the first thing they should do?
The first thing to do is to observe. So rather than designing for something right out of the gate, understanding and mapping your existing conditions, thinking about your current uses and your long-term uses, the existing conditions, like the existing vegetation, um, what water is doing on your site, how to understand where it's a nuisance versus an asset. In the book, I break down by each pillar what to observe on the site and how to go about mapping that. So that once you have kind of your existing conditions, the landscape that you build can then respond to those existing conditions in a way that's kind of harnessing their momentum rather than trying to work against it.
Where do you see permaculture evolving over the next 20 years? I know it's a long time to look ahead, but
Yeah.
what do you see the future of it?
That's a great question. I think it's becoming more widely accepted. I think when I started in permaculture, it was really considered kind of like a fringe movement in a lot of ways. And I think
Mhm.
people, are in municipalities, like they're getting on board because there's an economic and pragmatic benefit to managing
Mhm.
landscapes in a regenerative way, you know, versus the way that we've been doing it, where, going back to the stormwater example, so many municipalities are starting to understand that they need to mandate, especially in rainy areas, they need to mandate that new construction manages a certain amount of rainwater on site
Mhm.
versus sending it to the stormwater system, because the downstream effects of that and the cost to taxpayers to constantly upgrade municipal stormwater infrastructure, it's so great versus the cost of like digging a couple rain gardens,
Mhm.
on a
Mhm.
site and managing that water. So I think, and also from the planting perspective and the soil perspective, there's a lot less inputs that are needed over time, and there are a lot healthier landscapes ultimately. And I think people are catching on to that, and municipalities are catching on to that. And I think that's really the direction it's going, is become more of the standard of how we manage landscapes versus this, kind of fringe concept.
Is no-till different than permaculture? Or are they
Um,
together? Or like, do they?
Yeah, I mean, they can work together. I would say no-till is one
Mhm.
strategy within soil building in permaculture.
Okay.
So a lot of
Okay.
agriculture systems that are designed through the principles of permaculture, advocate no-tilling, meaning you're not disrupting the soil year after year and breaking the carbon cycle and
Mhm.
needing to add inputs and nutrients. Instead, you're kind of building on the soil's layers over time and designing perennial systems that don't require
Mhm.
consistent turning. Usually when
Yeah.
we advocate for tilling, it's in the transition phase of an ecosystem. You're taking it from this to that. But then as a
Mhm.
long-term management strategy, it tends to be more effective in the landscaping world to build the soil structure and build the plant communities than it is to constantly disturb the soil. But in certain types of agriculture, I think there's a case to be made for tilling up the beds and starting over. So I don't think it's
Yeah.
rigid one way or the other, but there's definitely space for that within permaculture.
Yeah. How long does it typically take once someone starts to say, okay, I want to turn my backyard into a forest that is self sustaining? How long does that process typically take before someone reaches their goal?
If you're trying to put in a food forest, I would say, uh, the planning phase and the implementation you could probably do in the first 2 seasons or so.
Mhm.
But then I would say the first 3 seasons after implementation are really the time where it's getting established, right? So it's like they say roots,
Mhm.
shoots, and fruits are what you expect. So first year, you're not going to see much outward growth. Everything's like rooting in. Second year, you might see some new green growth put on, and then eventually you'll see the fruit, third year or beyond. So if you're designing a food forest, I would
Mhm.
say realistically, you're looking at probably like a 4 to 7 year window before you start really
Mhm.
harvesting from that. Um, But if you're designing, more of an ecological landscape that has some food production as part of it, it really depends. Like perennials are going to establish a lot quicker than, putting in a full forest. If you're taking
Hmm.
a pasture and you're turning it into forest, that could be a 30-year proposition. So it really
Yeah.
depends.
I a food forest is so dreamy that I've been thinking about it for probably I think probably 8 years ago I started watching YouTube videos about food forests, and I do have, but my problem is that I have 20 acres, so it's so vast that to turn that into a food forest, my fruit trees are hundreds of yards apart. So, I mean, not the ones
Right.
that need to pollinate each other, but I've got peaches over there, pears over there, plums over there, and cherries over here, and apples over there. And I'm working on it. And I do have some
Hmm.
3-year-old peach trees that produced 2 peaches this year. I had 2 peaches from my
Yay!
peach trees. But yeah, it is a long process. But honestly, just once you get there, looking back at all of the work that it takes to get to some place like a food forest or even just a couple of fruit trees. You don't have to have a
Hmm.
forest of fruit trees, but it's
Right.
just so rewarding because you watched every step happen. And I think that's one of my favorite parts about what you're talking about is in the permaculture world. I just love watching it evolve.
Hmm.
It's part of the
Yeah, they're
fun.
dynamic. They're not, so many of our landscapes, we treat them as like, I'm just going to put in grass and I'm going to put in a couple of bushes and a couple of trees and ta-da, and it's just going to always stay like this. But I think one of the beauties of regenerative agriculture and regenerative landscaping is really embracing the fact that it's a dynamic, changing ecosystem, and we get to
Yeah.
participate in that. It's
Yeah,
beautiful.
part of the experience. So, all right, we're
Hmm.
going to take a quick commercial break and then we're going to come back because I have one more question for Brandy. Stay with us. Welcome back. We are talking with Brandy, and Brandy's book is actually out today. What are the odds of that? We did not plan it this way. But my final question for Brandy before we talk a little bit more about the book is what inspires you in the garden?
So much inspires
Yes.
me in the garden, but the first thing that popped into my mind is being in the garden with my daughter and her just feeling at home amongst the plants, watching her graze fennel, for instance, as like a 1 year old. She loved it. And just thinking like, okay, she's got, we live in a city and yet she has a relationship with the land that she lives on. And that's really inspiring to me.
That is beautiful. I have so many great memories. My daughter's in college. Hate it,
Wow.
but it's crazy. But I go back and I'm so grateful for our technology with the photos because I have so many pictures of her as a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old planting little marigold seeds and helping me in my veggie garden. And those are really, some principles that she will carry with her for the rest of her life. So that's beautiful.
Mhm.
Very inspiring.
Mhm.
Okay, so your book's actually out today. This is crazy. And tell us the name of it again.
It's called The Complete Guide to Home Permaculture.
Okay. I am so excited. Congratulations. Is this your first book?
Thank you. It is. It is. Yeah.
Yay.
Thank you.
Applause,
Hopefully one of
applause.
many.
That's very exciting. I know. I have written a few books, but they're children's books and they're not published. They're just in a notebook. So someday,
Awesome. That's
someday.
awesome.
Well, I'm so happy for you. We will put links in the description of this episode so that everyone can check it out. And we will also add all of your socials there too, so people can find you online to follow your
Awesome.
permaculture journey. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you so
Brandy, for hanging
much.
out with me today. It's been such a pleasure.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
And I will just share what's inspiring me today. We are now a few weeks into the new year. We've had a January thaw. I'm so grateful for that after last winter. And I have some seedlings in my grow room starting to germinate and the prospect of a brand new season that's yet to have any flaws or issues. That's inspiring me today. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I'm your host, Nicole Pitt, and you can find more of my garden adventures over on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook at Flower Hill Farm. And of course, all of the seeds and garden goodies we talked about are waiting for you at botanicalinterests.com. Or check your favorite local garden center to see if they carry botanical interests, like we do at the Boone Street Nursery. Save 5% by using the code INTHEGARDEN. Want to see what we're talking about? Subscribe to the Botanical Interests YouTube channel for the video version. We'll see you next time in the garden. I'll meet you there.